Happy and blessed Good Friday to all of you from Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia. I want to read, not word for word, but in a summary form, with some commentaries, Andrew Lenoir's article, No Easy Answers, written or at least published in March 2019. And since on Saturday, April the 20th, we will mark the 20th anniversary of the Columbine High School Massacre, which happened near Littleton in the Denver region of Colorado in Western United States. I want to provide those YouTube viewers who want to think about that massacre more profoundly a chance to examine it from different viewpoints. No copyright infringement obviously intended. No Easy Answers, the full story of the Columbine High School shooting. And this was published on March the 15th, 2019. Why the motives for the Columbine High School shooting had nothing to do with bullying or revenge? Well, I would respectfully and partly disagree with the second one. That there probably were some students who, in their opinion, had been more popular at their expense, and especially in Eric Harris's warped mind, twisted mind, had supposedly diminished his desire to be so popular and to be the center of attention among those teenagers. And why the real truth is even more disturbing. On the morning of Tuesday, April the 20th, 1999, Columbine High School senior student Brooks Brown noted something strange. His on-again, off-again friend Eric Harris had missed morning lessons. Even stranger, Harris, a straight A student, had missed their philosophy exam. Just before lunch period, it was already past 11 a.m. local time. Brown walked outside toward the designated smoking area near the school parking lot. He admitted in a videoed interview that is available, I think, on YouTube still, that he himself had skipped or been absent without a legitimate reason from one of the morning lessons. On the way there, he encountered Harris, who was wearing a trench coat and pulling a bulky duffel bag from his car, parked far from its designated spot. And then Brown basically asked him, and this is from a dramatized version of the shooting. What's the matter with you? You missed the test. And then mockingly, Eric Harris laughed and replied, doesn't matter anymore. And then he said these partly comforting, partly chilling words. Brooks, I like you now. Get out of here, go home. And although Brooks Brown was a smart student, just like Eric and Dylan were, he didn't realize tragically. Of course, I mean, I'm not saying that he had anything to do with the shooting. He didn't. But neither he nor any other student realized until the rampage actually started what Eric and Dylan were up to. If Brooks had realized this and on time, and if he had had access to a cell phone, and if he had run into a law enforcement officer, he could have quickly filed a report, and then police officers might have arrived there already before the shooting started in earnest, and definitely before the main part of the shooting, the deadliest part of the shooting, which occurred in the school library, started. As it happened, there was a police officer who apparently had started his lunch break, if I remember correctly, from one of the several websites about this massacre I've reviewed, and who was probably on the other side of the lot, so not visible to Brooks Brown. I've never been to Columbine High School, so I can only picture it. And yes, I admit I have my former Canadian high school in Thunder Bay, Ontario in mind, that parking lot. And of course, the school building, it was and probably still is like one of its wings coming from the south, if I remember correctly, the direction south, southeast, southwest, whatever. Its east wing is near a street, and then there is that lot, that parking lot, and there at least was back when I was still attending the school, a gravel sports track, running track with that green field in the middle for throwing events. So, and the Columbine High School was rather large, as was also that high school in Canada when I attended it in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. So it was easy for people to miss each other, even if they were on the school grounds. If, for example, there were several or many hundreds of meters between them and the school building happened to block the view, happened to be between them. But I mean, it was so surprising that that even when that part-time visual arts teacher, Patty Nielsen, yelled to the teenagers who were in the library that there were students with guns in the hallway, the students either were paralyzed by shock or inaction, or then doubt, suspicion. Some thought that those senior students were simply doing something silly to get many laughs. And it wasn't until then those two gunmen, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, burst through the library doors in there that they realized that the part-time art teacher had indeed been correct in her warning. Brown was confused, and that was nothing new in his relationship with Harris, because over 1 year earlier, 15 months earlier, in January 1998, Harris had on his personal website posted a death threat against Brown. And Brown's parents had taken the death threat seriously enough to file a report to one of the local police stations. And indeed, a police officer had written an affidavit which, if acted on, would have allowed police officers to search Eric Harris's home. And in that case, it is likely that they would have found Eric Harris's murderous plans, because he had been assembling that arsenal for a long time, over 1 year, probably, with Dylan Klebold, without their parents' knowledge and even their other friends' knowledge. One of Dylan's friends, the girl who was his prom date, just 3 days before the shooting, had even innocently bought a gun. Yeah, 1 or 2 guns, probably just one gun. She was already 18 years old and therefore an adult, and she could buy it for Dylan. And she had no idea that Dylan would use that gun to shoot fellow students. Yeah, so within the last year, or somewhat over a year, Harris had done things like repeatedly vandalize the Browns' house, post death threats against him online, and brag about his experience building pipe bombs. Maybe confused or in disbelief, this is my addition and interpretation. Brown shook his head and walked away from campus, weighing whether to skip the next period or lesson. When he was a block away, the noises started. At first, he thought they were fireworks. Maybe Harris was pulling a senior prank. In other words, some kind of joking fake attack or other situation that would be good for laughs. But then the sounds became faster. Gunfire, unmistakable. Brown started running, knocking on doors until he found a telephone. And he did report this. If only he had had a cell phone, and if only he had realized early enough that Eric and Dylan were actually going on this rampage. But probably they were so unpredictable, especially Harris, whose behavior had become so erratic that Brown didn't know when to take, especially Harris, seriously. And I give him the benefit of the doubt on that. Probably, if I had been in Brown's position, I would have acted much the same way. And I only received my first cell phone in maybe in November or December 2003. So over 4.5 years after this massacre. So within an hour, 18-year-old Harris, who had turned 18 just 11 days earlier, and his 17-year-old partner, Dylan Klebold, a fellow Columbine high school student and Brown's first friend since first grade, were dead. In that same time, they had murdered 12 students and had fatally wounded one teacher, who would then die, I think, between 2 and 3 p.m. Tragically, before the police officers located that classroom where he was slowly bleeding to death, in what was then the deadliest school shooting in American history. In the 20 years since, an accepted explanation for the Columbine shooting has been driven into the public imagination. Harris and Klebold were said to be outcasts who were bullied and finally pushed over the edge. It's a perception that directly inspired the modern anti-bullying movement and spawned a recurring media trope appearing in films and television series like 13 Reasons Why, Degrassi, Law and Order, and others. Incidentally, I'm old enough to have watched Degrassi Junior High, and a Canadian teen age, comedy/drama television series that was broadcast in the late 1980s and perhaps still in the early 1990s. This myth, born from several factors, provides a comforting and simplified explanation of the Columbine shooting, but it's not totally a myth. Increasingly, as the end of the 20th century approached, there was a culture of violence and death found in many films, found on the television, found on the then fledgling internet, one of whose early users, or two of whose early users and active users, even addicts, Harris and Klebold were. Harris to an even greater extent than Klebold. And then this increasing secularization affecting all the Western countries, so the European countries, North American countries, Australia and New Zealand, and increasingly countries outside the official Western world. In Latin America, Africa, Asia, and Oceania outside Australia and New Zealand. So in any case, while I see the writer's point and I respect all the time he has done to research and write this article, I cannot fully agree with it. And this writer also does not seem to at all consider the spiritual dimension. And the spiritual dimension, of course, has to do with the ongoing battle between God and Satan over the hearts and lives, the souls and spirits, and even to some extent the bodies of men and women and boys and girls. There were at least 3 born-again Christians, possibly and hopefully many more, among the 13 victims who were killed. And then the perpetrators, of course, as we know, took their own lives. Two of these born-again Christians have received a massive amount of publicity in the 2 decades that have passed since the Columbine High School shooting. Cassie Bernal, who had herself dabbled in the occult for some or several years, or well, some years anyway, especially since 1994, and who had, by God's grace, been saved during a weekend youth retreat somewhere in Colorado, near the Rocky Mountains. Her Christian friend, a girl whose schoolmate she had become in January 1997, when her parents had required her to switch schools from her old high school, where she had had at least 2 profoundly troubled friends whose real names were probably not given, Mona and Rick. And then she had been forced by her parents to become a student of a small private Christian school. And then in just 2 months, she had bonded with a Christian girl, Jamie, who had started to pray for Cassie and had so gently shared the gospel with her that by the first week, or the first week of March, or the last week of February 1997, Jamie had written a letter to Cassie's parents begging them to let her attend, with Jamie, of course, that weekend, Christian weekend youth retreat. She attended it, and that praise and worship music was used by God to break Cassie's resistance to the gospel, to Jesus Christ, to salvation and cleansing. And outside the building, Cassie then broke down in tears and prayed God to forgive her. And that day was March the 8th, 1997. So 2 years and roughly 1.5 months before she was killed. Then another girl who had been a Christian already for at least some, possibly several years, Rachel Scott, whose father even was a pastor. Tragically, her parents had divorced in the late 1980s when she was still maybe in grade 2 or 1 or 2, maybe, I'm sure. And she had written a profoundly thoughtful journal of reflections about the struggle to follow Jesus Christ and about poems. And she had had a premonition that she would not live long. She had written slightly under 1 year before the massacre, I think on May the 2nd, 1998, in her journal, this thoughtful entry: "This will be my last year, Lord. I've gotten all that I've asked for. Thank you," or something like that. So at least Rachel Scott was definitely targeted for her beliefs, because she had evangelized the 2 killers. And unfortunately, they had mocked her for it. And in one of their videotapes, they had laughed at Rachel Scott and another girl who had been sharing the gospel with them, if I remember correctly. Years ago on YouTube, I watched it and listened to it as an audio file. And Rachel had also, in no uncertain terms, expressed her disgust at their violent and bloody or gory videos. They were attending a video course together. She made friendly videos with cool music. And for those 2 reasons, her open testimony about Jesus Christ, and then secondly, of course, with the intent of persuading them to give their lives to Jesus Christ. And then secondly, her open disapproval of their violent, sinister, and death-oriented videos made her prime target. There are conflicting reports, of course. We don't know for sure, and probably will not know this side of eternity, whether either Eric Harris or Dylan Klebold asked either Rachel Scott or then Cassie Bernal if they believed in God. Chances are that they did not, but that, of course, does not diminish the value of Rachel Scott's and Cassie Bernal's Christian lives and testimonies. It's easy to get bogged down in these side issues and then claim that even Christian pastors have been deliberately lying. Well, not necessarily, because there are conflicting reports. According to Richard Castaldo, a boy, now of course a middle-aged man, who survived the shooting with serious wounds and who had sat down on the grass outside the Columbine High School building because it was finally mild enough to eat lunch outside, and then had probably started to eat lunch or was about to start eat lunch outside with with Rachel Scott, who was one of his good friends, when those killers approached. And then either Eric Harris or Dylan Klebold shot Rachel Scott from a distance, or then either one of the two boys or possibly both came close to them and then shot Rachel in point blank range after first asking her if she believed in God, and then she replied, "You know I do." In this version, which appears actually in that dramatized version of or dramatized film about Rachel Scott's life, I Am Not Ashamed, which I think is still available on YouTube. I urge you to watch it if you want to do that, because it tells the story of Rachel's struggles as a Christian, a teenage Christian, and then her struggles of reaching out to some unsaved fellow teens and so forth. So in that version, Eric Harris probably first shot and wounded Rachel, maybe in one of her legs or anyway elsewhere in her body. Rachel was wounded but was still alive, and then walked up to Rachel, maybe pulling her head up, and said, "Do you still believe in God?" And then Rachel replied, "You know I do." "Then go be with him," Eric Harris cruelly replied, and then shot her dead. Or then this exchange of words didn't take place, but Rachel was shot dead from a greater distance. And then Cassie Bernal, according to Emily Wyant, a fellow student who was under the same table as Cassie, recalled later that Cassie was quietly praying, dear God, why is this happening? I just want to go home," or something like that. And then Eric Harris reached the table under which they were hiding. He peered down to see them, yelled "peekaboo," and then shot Cassie dead. According to another account, which was based on the testimony of Craig Scott, one of the survivors, and incidentally Rachel Scott's brother, who has been together with Rachel's older sister, instrumental in this pro-friendship, pro-conflict resolution, pro-reaching out to lonely or otherwise troubled students. Rachel's challenge in most of the 2 decades that have passed since the Columbine High School massacre. He said he believed or thought that it was Cassie who was asked by one of the 2 boys if she believed in God, and then that Cassie was shot dead. Incidentally, Valine Schnurr, a Catholic girl, now of course woman, a middle-aged woman, she was first wounded, and then she cried out, oh my God, don't let me die." And then either Eric or Dylan asked her if she believed in God, She said yes, and then asked why. Because I believe, and my parents brought me up that way, was Valine's answer. She miraculously survived despite having multiple gunshot wounds. But let's get back to the article. As Brooks Brown put it or wrote in his 2002 book about the attack, there are no easy answers. Well, that's certainly true. Until January 1998, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold lived fairly normal lives. Klebold, a Colorado native, was noted for his shyness and intellect. He and Brooks Brown both attended the Colorado CHIPS, Challenging High Intellectual Potential Students program for gifted children starting in the 3rd grade. Brown left within a year, citing the competitive attitude among the students and the lack of support from teachers. Klebold, equally miserable, remained in the program until he aged out in 6th grade. And he was known for bottling up his emotions, something that his mother, Sue, has noted in several interviews that she gave since she published her partly autobiographical and partly biographical book, A Mother's Reckoning, in early 2016. And then, because he had a tendency to keep his feelings to himself, Klebold exploded in uncharacteristic rages. Eric Harris was actually born in Wichita, Kansas, so in the US Midwest, or prairies, was the son of an Air Force pilot and spent much of his childhood moving from place to place. Fascinated by war stories, he regularly played soldier, pretending to be a Marine with his older brother. Oh, so also he had an older brother who probably is still alive, and so is Dylan's older brother, whose first name, according to one of the interviews that Mrs. Klebold gave in 2016, is also Byron. Is Byron, not also Byron, but Byron. A neighborhood children in rural Michigan, so in the upper Midwest and Great Lakes region of the United States. In his imagination, games were full of violence and he was always the hero. So maybe this was one of his perverted fantasies that he wanted to then act out, even though he knew, along with his friend Dylan, that they would both be killed in that attack. At age 11, meaning in 1992 or 1993, he discovered Doom, a pioneering action horror first-person shooter video game. And in 1993, they moved to Colorado. By the start of his sophomore year at Columbine High School, Harris had created, so 1996, fall of 1996 probably, Harris had created 11 different custom levels for Doom and its sequel, Doom 2. Harris and Klebold met in middle school, but didn't become inseparable until midway through high school. While some suggest the two boys were targets of bullying, many more accounts show them as fairly popular, although I would say not super popular, especially Eric Harris because of his rather negative personality, maintaining a sizable group of friends. Well, according to Mrs. Klebold, Dylan had a fairly small group of friends. One of the Hitmen for Hire videos that Harris and Klebold made for a film class, yeah, it seems to be a sentence fragment. Anyway, that featured them entering the school dressed in those so-called trench coats. Among others, Harris, Klebold, and Brown bonded over a shared love of philosophy and video games. Brown joined the theater department and Klebold followed, working backstage as a soundboard operator. They regularly attended football games, cheering on Harris's older brother, the starting kicker of the Columbine High School football team, the Rebels. That connection earned Harris some more popularity, and he even managed to find a date for freshman homecoming. When that girl said she did not want to continue seeing him, Harris displayed one of his early warning signs. So, contrary to his friend Klebold, he did show negative emotions quite openly. While Brown distracted her, Harris covered himself and a nearby rock with fake blood, letting out a scream before playing dead. The girl never spoke to him again, but at the time, Harris's friends thought the fake suicide was pretty funny. And then, bullying was fairly common at Columbine High School and, of course, at millions of other schools around the world. And then the subordinate sentence is very sad to read, and teachers reportedly did little to stop it. For Halloween 1996, so roughly 2.5 years before the shooting or shootings, one routinely bullied junior named Eric Dutrow had his parents buy him a black duster jacket for a Dracula costume. The costume fell through, but he decided that he liked the trench coat and the attention it got him. Soon his friends began to wear them too, even in 80-degree heat. So that's about 27 degrees Celsius. When one athlete commented that the group looked like a trench coat mafia, the French turned it into a badge of pride. And the name stuck. In other words, remained in that discourse. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold were not in the trench coat mafia, most of whom had graduated by 1999, but their friend Chris Morris was. So that was one of the myths about the two murderous boys. Morris had a part-time job at the local Blackjack pizza restaurant and helped Harris get a job there the summer after sophomore year. So the summer of 1997. Soon Klebold followed suit. So Klebold seems to have been somewhat of a follower, more than a leader. Harris was a relatively good employee, punctual, polite, and well put together at work. I noticed the emphasis in my voice, at work. He seems to have been a master manipulator and deceiver who enjoyed having double or even triple lives. So much so that he eventually became shift manager during his senior year, using his position to win over girls with free slices. The boys and their co-workers would routinely goof around during slow hours, drinking beer and shooting bottle rockets off the roof. During this time, the deadly bond between Harris and Klebold truly took shape. It was also when their behavior changed, with Harris becoming bolder and stranger, while the impressionable Klebold followed suit. Skipped over some paragraphs. After Halloween 1997, so with roughly 1.5 years remaining before the shootings, Harris and Klebold bragged about shooting trick-or-treaters with a BB gun. The same year, Klebold was suspended for carving homophobic insults into a freshman boy's locker. He had hacked the school's computer system, since just like Harris, his friend, he was a skilled user of computer. One or more of the teachers had given him the privilege of working with the school's computer system, for example, to monitor or at least to monitor the use of lockers. And then this boy had become the boyfriend of a girl who had been his brief love interest. So, seemingly out of childish/boyish jealousy, he had posted the threat, but it should have been an early warning sign that he was actually considering more than just verbally insulting fellow teens, but even killing them. Meanwhile, Harris started to pushing people away. Unable to drive yet, he relied on Brown for rides to and from school. Brown was routinely late, which drove Harris crazy. Finally, after one argument that winter, 1997 to 98, Brown told Harris he would never give him a ride again. A few days later, parked at a stop sign by Harris's bus stop, Harris shattered Brown's windshield with a block of ice. Furious, Brown told his and Harris's parents about the latter's mischief, drinking, and other bad behavior. In January 1998, Klebold approached Brown in school, handing him a piece of paper with a web address written on it. "I think you should look at this tonight," he said, adding, "and you can't tell Eric I gave it to you." Brown was never sure why he had done that, but Columbine author Dave Cullen suspects it was one of several attempts to draw attention to Harris's behavior, a cry for help. On the website Harris's America Online, or AOL profile, where he wrote under the name Reb for Rebel, sometimes Reb Doomer, he detailed his nocturnal exploits with vodka, Klebold's screen name. Vodka is a common or popular strong alcoholic beverage coming from the Russian word for a little water, not just in Eastern Europe, but also in, the Asian side of Russia, meaning Central, Northern, and Eastern Asia, but also in several countries of Northern and even Central Europe. Describing various acts of vandalism, including building pipe bombs and his desire to kill people, namely Brooks Brown. Or as he wrote on his website, "I don't care if I die. I just want to kill as many of you," expletive deleted, "as I can, especially a few people like Brooks Brown." Brown's parents called the police, and then the rest is history. An affidavit was indeed written by a police officer, but it got misplaced, or maybe because the threat didn't sound seriously enough, and because maybe even partly because Harris and Klebold pretended so skillfully to feel sorry for stealing some stereo equipment from the back of a truck, or a van parked somewhere in that region, that it was never acted on until it was too late. Harris's father, Wayne, managed to get both boys into a juvenile diversion program. So, if he hadn't believed that his son and then his son's best friend, or very good friend, Dylan Klebold, would deserve a lenient sentence, maybe the boys would have received a harsher sentence, a probationary period, and if they got into any kind of trouble with the law, again, they would go to jail. Or would have gone to jail. Once successfully completed, both boys were deemed, mistakenly as it turned out later, tragically, rehabilitated and given clean records. Had the presiding judge seen the Browns report, or if the resultant search warrant had been executed, Harris would have been rejected and jailed for the van theft, and the police would have found his growing pipe bomb arsenal. For some reason, though, that information was not shared, and the search warrant went unsigned. By spring 1998, so just 1 year before the shootings, they were already planning Judgment Day, or NBK, shorthand for the film Natural Born Killers. In early 1998, Harris stopped posting online and began keeping a notebook he titled The Book of God. An ironic name for someone who probably did not even believe in a personal God, at least not the true God described by the Bible, but rather mocked those people who were true Christians, like Rachel Scott. Mostly dedicated to his homicidal fantasies and nihilistic philosophy, and I have once looked at probably a partial or edited version of it, and it was filled with this mocking and disdainful and expletive-ridden language, many swear words. if the censorship was still anywhere as tight as it was before the neoliberalism started to take over, or the permissive liberalism started to take over on a grand scale in the 1960s in most Western countries, it would be considered unprintable. Klebold had actually been keeping his own diary, Existences, a virtual book, since the previous spring. The differences between the two are striking. Klebold writes in florid morose, meaning sad prose and poetry about God, self-medicating with alcohol, cutting himself, and his persistent thoughts of suicide. Far more often than violence, he talks about love, both abstractly and personally. The journal contains 2 notes to a girl he was fixated on, neither of which were ever delivered, and many, many drawings of hearts. Overall, Klebold felt that he had ruined his life and that no one understood him. Other people were zombies, he thought, but they were also the lucky ones. Harris's journal is more single-minded. To him, people were robots conned into following a false social order, the same one that dared to judge him. I have something only me and we, meaning Klebold, have self-awareness, he wrote a year before the attack. A final solution like that of the Nazis, that was, of course, designed to rid Europe of its so-called Jewish problem. Sadly, there are many neo-Nazi groups, not just in Europe, but also elsewhere, like in North America nowadays. So how much have people learned from history? Of course, some have learned. There are millions of people who would never join anything like that, and who would even steer clear of those hyper-patriotic and hyper-nationalist groups that even smacked of Nazism or other extremist ideologies. But there are millions of other people who would join, who are so pent up with anger and frustration at the way things are going that they are willing to try any kind of ideology as long as it seems to give them fulfillment and seems to produce at least superficially effective results. Was what would save the world natural selection? Well, some fundamentalist Christians might even accuse the evolutionists of somehow encouraging or tolerating this kind of attitude, although, of course, evolutionary theory by itself had little or nothing to do with this massacre. The boys' Satanism, occultism, and nihilism had very much to do with it, and disillusionment with life, and rejection of God, of course. The same message printed on his shirt during the shooting. Often Harris's cruelty was unfocused and not tied to any particular slight. It was compulsive. In addition to hating human beings, loving Nazis, and wanting to kill mankind, in an entry from November of 1998, so just about 5 months before the shootings, he described his fantasies of raping girls from his school, stating, "I want to grab some weak little freshmen and just tear them apart like a wolf, show them who is God." And interestingly spelled with a small g. In a presentation to a conference of psychologists years after the shooting, Duane Fusilier, apparently a French name, fusil interestingly means rifle in French, of the FBI, presented his belief that based on his homicidal fantasies, skill at lying, and lack of remorse, Eric Harris was a budding young psychopath. And how many of such people are even among children, and not just boys, but also girls, nowadays, 20 years later, 20 years after the shootings. In response, one of the participants raised an objection. I think he was a full-blown psychopath. A number of other psychologists agreed. For a year before the Columbine shooting, Harris dedicated himself to building dozens of explosives, pipe bombs, and crickets made from carbon dioxide canisters. He looked into making napalm and at one point tried to recruit Chris Morris into what he had planned for these explosives, playing it off as a joke when the other refused, once again showing his deceptive side. The pair worked their final shift at Blackjack Pizza on Friday, April the 16th, 1999. Harris secured advances for them both to purchase last-minute supplies. Klebold attended prom with a group of 12 friends on Saturday, meaning April the 17th, while Harris went on a first and last date with a girl he had recently met. That Monday, April the 19th, the original date for the attack, because Harris and Klebold, especially Harris, admired Timothy McVeigh, another nihilistic desperado who had that day, 4 years earlier, in 1995, had perpetrated the Oklahoma City bombing where either over 60 or over 70 people died, and for which crime he eventually was executed in the first years of the 21st century. Harris postponed the plan so he could buy more bullets from a friend. He had apparently forgotten that he had just turned 18 and no longer needed a middleman. Or then he wanted to have a middleman so that there would be less evidence linking him to the buying of those guns. On April the 20th, both boys got up and left their houses by 5:30 a.m. to begin final preparations. Brown had also noted his friend's car was parked far from its usual place. That was because both Harris and Klebold's cars were rigged to explode as police, ambulances, and journalists arrived, killing many in the process. That was the plan, but it failed. A final bomb was placed in a park 3 miles from school, so some 4.8 kilometers from school, set to go off before the others. This, they hoped, would draw away police, buying time before the authorities arrived and killed them. Suicide by police officer was Harris and Klebold's intended finale. Even this bomb probably did not go off. Yes, that's true. As anyone familiar with the Columbine shooting knows, none of that happened. Because these bombs were so much bigger than the others, Harris and Klebold could not hide them at home. Instead, they were hastily constructed on the morning of the attack, and as it turned out, amateurishly. Smart as both boys were, they had no idea how to wire detonators and failed to figure it out in the limited time allotted for their construction. Thankfully, not one of these bombs went off, because if that had happened, tens more people, potentially perhaps even hundreds more, would have been killed. Well, hundreds more would definitely have been killed had the bombs placed in the cafeteria detonated and had that alert and smart and quickly reacting business and computer science teacher and sports coach David Sanders not realized that an armed attack was about to be perpetrated by some students, and had he not vigorously and quickly evacuated the cafeteria, yelling at the students to go to classrooms and lock themselves in. With this central failure in mind, the rest of the killer's actions take on new significance. Apparently, Klebold got cold feet, in other words, was scared when the cafeteria did not explode. They were supposed to stand many yards from each other for an optimal firing range, but when the shooting started, the two were standing together at Klebold's assigned position. From this, it can be inferred that Harris had to convince Klebold to go through with the attack at the last minute. Even after that, Harris did most of the shooting. About half an hour into the attack, so roughly was it 11:45 a.m., Harris and Klebold were in the school library with nearly 50 people at their mercy. Then they left, allowing the majority to escape, including Craig Scott and then Crystal Woodman Miller, who committed her life to Jesus Christ that day and is now a fairly popular and well-known motivational speaker and Christian writer in the United States. The next time they shot people, it was to kill themselves. The turning point seems to be when, after killing one student in the library, Harris's shotgun recoiled into his face, breaking his nose. Security cameras show they then went to the cafeteria trying and failing to set off the propane tanks with pipe bombs and shotgun blasts. They then tried provoking police by firing through the windows, but the officers neither hit them nor entered the building. Finally, Klebold and Harris returned to the library where most of their victims had already died, with a few or some wounded and probably unconscious, before picking a spot with a view of the Rocky Mountains and shooting themselves in the head. Reportedly, they shouted 1, 2, 3 in unison before shooting themselves dead. Compared with Harris and Klebold's ambitions, especially Harris's, the Columbine High School attack was a complete failure. Originally planned for April the 19th, the 6th anniversary of the Waco siege by that apocalyptic Branch Davidian cult, led by that self-styled prophet or Messiah, of course a false one, David Koresh, not his original name, and the 4th anniversary of the Oklahoma City bombing by Timothy McVeigh. The attack, Harris hoped, would beat Timothy McVeigh's body count in Oklahoma. He fantasized about planting bombs around Littleton and Denver, and in one journal entry wrote that if he and Klebold survived Judgment Day, they should hijack an airplane and crash it into New York City, as happened nearly 2.5 years later on September the 11th, 2001. And actually 2 airplanes were crashed, both into the Twin Towers, or one of the Twin Towers. Eric Harris did not see himself as a good child pushed to violence. He wanted to be a domestic terrorist, but he wanted to die in the process. Maybe in some perverted desire to become a terrorist martyr. In an apparent answer to his parents' concerns about his future, he wrote, "This is what I wanted to do with my life." The Columbine shooting was among the first national tragedies in the era of cell phones and the 24-hour news cycle. Reporters were at the school interviewing traumatized teenagers as the events unfolded. Some students, unable to get through to overloaded emergency services, began calling news stations that then broadcast their understandably unreliable eyewitness testimony across the world. Klebold and Harris were 2 of 2,000 students at Columbine High School. Most interviewees did not know them, but that did not stop them from answering questions. From a few shock-jumbled pieces, the flawed popular image began to form. Klebold was in the theater department, so he was a homosexual and mocked for it. Both boys wore trench coats during the attack, so they were in the trench coat mafia. The police were another problem. The Jefferson County Sheriff had only been in office since January 1999, and tragically, he did not know how to handle the situation. Instead of sending in SWAT teams, police held their perimeter until after Harris and Klebold had killed themselves and had killed 12 of their 13 victims. One victim, David Sanders, was allowed to bleed out due to the slow police response, which probably sparked some conspiracy theories. And multiple bodies were left where they were, 2 outside and uncovered overnight for fear of booby traps. Some parents were not even told their children were killed. They learned about it in the newspaper. Worse still was the dirty secret that Brooks Brown and his family shared almost immediately. The police had been warned about Eric Harris. An affidavit for a search warrant had been written. Not only could the Columbine shooting have been prevented, it should have been. As a result, resources were shifted from an investigation to a cover-up. On TV, the sheriff labeled Brooks Brown an accomplice to silence him. Victims' families fought and failed in the Colorado courts to get documents released. The police file on Eric Harris went mysteriously missing. And once again, more fuel for the conspiracy theorists like Alex Jones, I assume. The full facts of what happened and what caused the Columbine High School massacre were not released until 2006, so 7 years later, long after the public had moved on. Today, most people still think, or many people, this is my modification and interpretation, still think Columbine could have been stopped if only someone had been a little nicer to Eric Harris, a humanizing story that covers over a truth too terrible to think about.